It was a dark and gloomy night when a young girl named Emily went on a solo journey through a deep forest. She knew perfectly well that there were rumors about sometimes terrible events in this place, but her curiosity and desire for adventure prevailed. After leaving the last inhabited point, Emily spent several hours on the road until she found herself in the wilderness. The evening promised to be especially cold, and she decided to find shelter for the night. Seeing a gloomy castle in the distance, she could not resist the temptation and resolutely went there. The castle looked desolate and abandoned, as if its inhabitants did not care about cleanliness and order. Climbing the icy stairs, Emily went inside and found herself in a huge lobby. The evil atmosphere reigning inside terrified her, but curiosity pushed the girl further. Moving along the endless corridors and halls, she noticed traces of some strange activity. Scant candles on the walls illuminated dark corners, as if hinting that hidden in the shadows. Not so harmless. Suddenly, from the depths of the castle there was a strange sound, crunching and rustling. Startled, Emily stopped and listened intently. After a few moments, the sound was repeated, and now it was louder. She decided to follow him and quietly headed towards the sound. Her heart was beating faster, and a feeling of anxiety finally gripped her. The deeper she moved through the castle, the stronger the sound became. And finally, she went out into the yard and saw him a vampire. With his pale face, sharp fangs, and bloody cloak, he stood in front of her. His eyes were as red as charcoal being lit on a fire. Emily felt her body stiffen with fear. She couldn't believe she'd run into a vampire right here in this abandoned castle. The vampire approached her with slow, frightening steps, and smiled. His teeth shone against the background of the night darkness. So, Emily stood in front of the vampire, feeling fear squeeze her heart. The vampire smiled even wider and stepped closer, his long and sharp claws flashing against the cold moon. A painful silence reigned around, and the castle was covered with impenetrable darkness. The vampire was slowly approaching Emily, like a predator intending to make his bloody feast. But at the same time, his eyes were emitting something strange, not only bloodlust, but also some kind of unfathomable pain hidden behind his gloomy appearance. Emily's heart was pounding so hard that she almost couldn't breathe. She tried to step back, but her legs seemed weak and unruly. Noticing her helplessness, the vampire approached even closer. His icy breath felt on the girl's face. "So beautiful," the vampire whispered, bringing his fangs closer to Emily's neck. Suddenly, something shuddered in his eyes, and he violently threw himself away from the girl. Emily was confused and looked to see what had happened. There, in the corner of the castle, on an ancient stone altar, I saw the figure of another vampire, beautiful, but still more embittered. He looked sharply at the first vampire and whispered something in an incomprehensible language. As a result, a powerful wave of energy swept through the castle, devouring the darkness and malice in the first vampire with fire. The first vampire only managed to whisper curse before his power and essence disappeared before his eyes. The second vampire, with dark eyes, came up to Emily and held out his hand to her. She couldn't resist and stretched out her hand to him, feeling a heartbeat and a wave of relief. "You need to be careful before exploring such places, little traveler," the second vampire said with a sad smile. "Dark magic often hides dangers that cannot be underestimated." He led Emily to the exit of the castle, carefully protecting her from the disturbing forces that took possession of the place. But with each step, they gave up hope for answers about the castle's past and its mysterious inhabitants. After some time, the second vampire and Emily continued to explore the castle, trying to uncover its deep secrets. They discovered a secret room hidden behind a bookshelf. The room had an old bed and a table covered with dust and cobwebs. There was an old letter on the table that looked forgotten for years. The second vampire picked it up and began to read it aloud. The letter told about the past owners of the castle, who were victims of a bloodthirsty vampire. They tried to cope with his sinister power, but to no avail. At the end of the letter, a ritual spell was described that could destroy a vampire and free the castle from its curse. The second vampire and Emily began to search through the castle for the remnants of such a spell. They found an old altar in the dungeon, where the instructions for the ritual were indicated on the wall. They collected all the necessary ingredients: vampire blood, sacred herbs, and an amulet that belonged to the ancestors of the owners of the castle. On the full moon, with the arrangement of the stars indicated in the instructions, they began to perform the ritual on the altar. The second vampire spilled a drop of his blood on the amulet, uttered forbidden words, and touched the edge of the altar. A powerful wave of energy passed through them, shook the castle, as if waking him from a long sleep. There was the sound of breaking glass, and a grand whirlwind of dark forces shot up to the ceiling of the castle. They saw the shape of a vampire trying to resist, but it was weakening with every second. Eventually, his essence disappeared, and the castle was freed from his sinister influence. The second vampire and Emily looked with deep relief at the liberated and transformed castle. Now he was deprived of the evil forces that had been going on here for so many years. They left the amulet on the altar in gratitude for the rescue, and then, with determination, headed for the exit, leaving the castle and its secrets in the past. But their adventure was just beginning. There were still many mysteries, dangers, and encounters with the world of otherworldly forces ahead. Being bound by this random association, the second vampire and Emily went in search of other enchanted places where they could shake the foundations of the dark past and bring light to the world again. Gripped by the darkness of the night, the vampire slid through the dead alleys of the posthumous city. The gloomy shadows of the ancient ruins bent over him, as if eager to appropriate his evil spirit. The city was the perfect place for a vampire. Abandoned houses and streets shrouded in a mystical atmosphere were his home. Only a few desperate souls dared to get into these night quarters. They were still seized with an insurmountable anxiety, and the doomed residents of the city, in confusion, cast uncertain glances at the vampire, not knowing that in the dark the puppeteer was playing with their souls. But this time something was wrong. In the moonlight that filtered through the shattered windows, the vampire penetrated into the very core of this place locked away from the world. The horror and dark forces that had accumulated around him became unbearable. Suddenly, the vampire was struck by the smell of fresh blood. His sharp fangs began to drool, thirst burned in his eyes. Lurking in the shadows, he picked up the trail. His uncontrollable bloodlust intensified, and he quickened his pace. The black figure in the center of the city loomed more and more clearly. The vampire was approaching. When he reached his victim, the frozen figure suddenly came to life and turned around. It was a woman. She looked pale and fragile, as if ready to turn to dust at the first touch. She looked at the vampire with fear in her eyes, but something about her was strangely familiar. The vampire's heart sank, because this woman was a companion of his past. Memories of his old days crept into his mind, intertwining with the demonic nature of the vampire. She tried to run away, but paralyzed by fear, she still stood in front of him. The vampire approached her and, like a particle of dust in the wind, his hand slid over her cheek. "How dare you come back?" the vampire rumbled, his voice sounding sinister and obscene. She froze and horror was reflected in her eyes. Not me. It's not my fault," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How much blood will I have to shed to cleanse myself of you?" The vampire gritted his teeth. But before he could strike, the woman's exhausted body fell weakly in front of him. Her eyes dimmed, and her last breath was an apology. Everything became deadly quiet. The vampire was left alone with a dead body. His demonic essence filled the air and fell heavily on his conscience. The city began to shake, the walls collapsed, and the surrounding darkness literally disappeared, as if it had never existed. The vampire realized that all his demons had returned to collect his soul. When the last stone fell, the vampire next to the dead woman disappeared. His story is not over. It continues forever in the abyss of his own dark being, fed by human weakness and suffering. Such is the curse of a vampire, to be forever a prisoner of darkness and bloodlust. Their story never ends, but only reborn in a new era of cruelty and death.